I've always loved hiking alone. Some people don't get it. They say it's dangerous, stupid even. But to me, there's nothing better than walking into the woods, away from everything. No traffic, no noise, no people. Just trees, fresh air, and silence. I've done dozens of solo hikes over the years, some lasting a few days, others stretching over a week. I know how to navigate, how to pack light, how to handle myself. I don't take risks. I always leave a trip plan with someone, and I always bring a GPS and a backup compass. This hike was supposed to be like any other, just another trip, another escape. I was wrong. I parked my car at a small, rarely used trailhead in the Northern Rockies. No signs, no information boards, just a dirt pull-off with enough space for 2 or 3 vehicles. I'd found this route online, buried in an old forum post, a remote loop through untouched wilderness. No established trails, no campsites. It was exactly what I wanted. I checked my gear one last time: map, compass, GPS, extra food, first aid kit. Everything was there. I pulled on my pack and started walking. The first few miles were easy. A faint game trail led me through dense pine forests, the ground soft underfoot. Birds chirped, the wind rustled the branches. It felt good to be out here alone. By mid-afternoon, I reached a ridge overlooking a valley. My plan was to follow the ridge north, then descend toward a small river where I'd camp for the night. The landscape was beautiful, rolling hills, thick forests stretching for miles. No roads, no signs of civilization. I was deep in it now. By sundown, I had set up camp by the river. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat watching the flames. The only sounds were the water flowing nearby and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. I wasn't worried, but something felt different. I couldn't explain it. The air was still, too still. No wind, no distant hoots of owls, just silence. I ignored the feeling, crawled into my tent, and fell asleep. I woke early, packed up, and started moving. The plan was to follow the river upstream for a few miles, then cut west toward a high plateau. The morning was uneventful. The forest was thick, the ground uneven, but I made good time. Around noon, I stopped to check my GPS. That's when I noticed the first problem. The screen was frozen. I tapped it, turned it off and back on. Nothing, just a blank, useless display. No big deal. I had my map and compass. I could navigate the old-fashioned way. Still, it bugged me. I kept moving, but something felt off. The landscape wasn't matching up with my map. The river should have veered northwest by now, but it kept running straight. The hills were steeper than I expected, the trees denser. I told myself I must have misread the map. Maybe I was a little off course, but I could correct it. Then I found the footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, deep in the mud near the riverbank. A single set heading in the same direction I was going. They looked like boot prints. Someone else had been here maybe just hours ago. I didn't like that. This area wasn't popular. I had specifically chosen this route because it was remote. The chances of running into another hiker were almost zero. So who was out here? I stood there for a long time, staring at the tracks, my skin crawling. Then I kept walking. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was imagining things. I was wrong. I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent made me jump. I kept imagining someone standing just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. By morning, I was exhausted, but I had to keep moving. I decided to change my route. Instead of heading west, I'd cut straight south, back toward my car. I wasn't enjoying this trip anymore. I started walking fast, barely stopping to check my bearings. The footprints were still there, always ahead of me. They weren't fading. Whoever had made them was close. I hiked for hours. The trees blurred together, my breath coming fast and hard. I just wanted to get out. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. My own campsite, the fire pit, the flattened grass where my tent had been. I had been walking all day. How was I back here? I didn't sleep. I sat by the dead fire, gripping my knife, my heart hammering. First light, I ran. I didn't check my map. I didn't care about direction. I just moved. The forest was endless, trees stretching in every direction. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. Then finally I saw it. A road. I stumbled onto the pavement, gasping. A truck was parked nearby. A man stood beside it, staring at me. I didn't ask questions. I just climbed into the truck, and he drove me away. I never found out who left those footprints. I never figured out how I ended up back at my campsite. And I don't care. I'm never going back. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys being alone in the wilderness. There's something about the quiet. No city noise, no people, no distractions. Just me, my thoughts, and the raw beauty of nature. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before. Some people called it reckless, but I called it necessary. It was my way of resetting, stepping away from everything and testing myself against the elements. This trip was supposed to be like all the others. A simple, solo, 3-day trek through a remote section of forest in the Pacific Northwest. It was an area I had researched, mapped out, and felt confident navigating. But I made mistakes, and in the wilderness, even a small mistake can spiral into something dangerous. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. The first day started as expected. I parked my car at a small trailhead, one of those unmarked pull-offs you only find if you know where to look. My pack was loaded with enough food for the trip, plus emergency supplies, a GPS, and my map. I had everything I needed. The weather was perfect, cool, crisp air, clear skies, no signs of rain. I moved fast, following the planned route through dense pine forests and rocky ridges. The trail was barely a trail at all, just a faint game path used more by deer than by humans. That's exactly why I had chosen this route. I didn't want to see anyone else. By late afternoon, I had covered about 10 miles. My legs were sore but strong, my pace good. I reached a small clearing where a narrow creek ran between two hills, my planned campsite for the night. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and made a small fire. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I ate a quick meal and sat watching the flames flicker. The only sounds were the crackling of burning wood and the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. I felt completely alone. I should have felt at peace, but I didn't. Something was bothering me, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The forest felt off. Not wrong exactly, but different. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired. I pushed the feeling aside, crawled into my tent, and fell asleep. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time I felt remotely safe. I woke early, packed up, and continued hiking. The plan was to push deeper into the backcountry, loop around a high ridge, and then work my way back toward the trailhead over the next 2 days. The morning was uneventful. Birds chirped in the trees, and the air smelled like damp earth and pine. I followed the ridgeline, keeping my compass pointed in the right direction. Everything was going smoothly, until it wasn't. At some point, the trail I had been following, faint as it was, vanished. 1 second, I was walking on a clear path. The next, it was gone. I stopped, checking my map and GPS. My location seemed right. I should have been on track, but the trail wasn't there. I turned in a slow circle, trying to spot anything that looked familiar. A landmark, a distinct tree, anything. Nothing. I wasn't panicked, yet. I had a compass, and I knew the general direction I needed to go. So I picked a path that seemed right and started walking. That was my mistake, because after an hour of hiking, I realized something. I was completely lost. I pulled out my GPS again. No signal. That was bad. I wasn't in real danger yet. I had food, water, supplies, but the realization that I was off course hit me hard. I tried to stay calm. I retraced my steps, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, more trees, no trail, no landmarks, no way of knowing if I was actually backtracking or just making things worse. By late afternoon, I knew I wasn't getting back on track before dark, so I made the decision to set up camp early. I found a relatively flat area beneath a cluster of pines, pitched my tent, and forced myself to eat even though I wasn't hungry. I told myself I'd figure it out in the morning. I was still telling myself that when I lay down in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind move through the trees. And that was when I heard the first noise. A rustling, not the wind, something moving. It was distant, just beyond my camp, but definitely there. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing, probably an animal, maybe a deer, but that uneasy feeling was back. And this time it was worse. I barely slept. Every sound made me tense. I kept imagining something standing just outside my tent, watching, waiting. By morning, I was exhausted, but I had to keep moving. I packed up and started hiking in what I hoped was the right direction. The forest felt different now. It wasn't just that I was lost. It was something else. The silence was deeper. The air felt heavier. And then I found something. A footprint. Not mine. It was fresh, deep. A boot print, slightly larger than mine. Someone else had been here recently. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. I followed the tracks for a while, but they disappeared into thick underbrush. No sign of a trail. No sign of where they led. I kept moving. Then, around midday, I saw it. Something hanging from a tree. Piece of fabric. I walked closer, my stomach twisting. It was a backpack. Torn, faded, covered in dirt. The straps had been cut. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. I wasn't alone. I started moving faster. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just needed to get out. The forest closed in around me, every shadow, every noise making my skin crawl. And then I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing. I started running. Branches scratched my arms. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Then, up ahead, I saw something. Clearing. A road. I stumbled toward it, lungs burning. And just like that, I was out of the trees. I barely registered the truck parked on the side of the road. The man standing beside it looked at me like I was crazy. I didn't care. I had made it out. I never found out who left that footprint, or whose backpack was hanging in that tree. I checked later, no missing person reports in that area. No records of hikers going missing. But I know what I felt. I wasn't alone out there. Something was watching me, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. Hiking alone had always been my escape. Some people drank, some went to therapy. I went into the woods. It was simple. Pack light, move fast, leave everything behind for a few days. No distractions, no people. I had done solo hikes before, but this trip was different. I was going deeper than I ever had, into a part of the forest where trails faded and maps weren't much help. It was supposed to be a challenge. Just me, my gear, and raw wilderness. I thought I was prepared. I was wrong. The idea was simple: 4 days in, 4 days out. A long loop through the Cascade Mountains, deep into an area where few hikers ever went. The trail started well enough, but after a day, it faded into little more than a game path. That was fine. I had my GPS, my map, my compass. I trusted my ability to navigate. I packed light, just the essentials. Tent, food, water filter, first aid, knife. Enough to survive, but not so much that it would slow me down. I told myself this was just another trip, another test of my skills. But looking back, I ignored a lot of small warnings. The moment I stepped off the main trail, everything felt different. The first 2 days went as planned. I moved fast, covering miles without issue. The landscape was beautiful. Steep ridges, deep green valleys, streams that ran cold and clear. No people, no noise. Just the sound of my footsteps and the occasional bird call. I camped by a small river the first night, cooked a meal, and watched the stars come out. The night was silent except for the wind moving through the trees. By the second day, I was deep into the backcountry. No more trails, just raw forest. The trees were massive, their trunks thick with moss. I followed a ridgeline, using my compass to stay on course. Everything was going smoothly until I found the hole. It was near the top of a ridge, in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. At first, I thought it was just a natural depression in the ground. But when I got closer, I saw that the edges were too perfect, too clean. It was about 6 feet wide, deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom. The dirt around the edges was loose, freshly disturbed. Something about it felt wrong. I stepped closer, peering down. The hole was deep, too deep. The sides were straight, almost like it had been dug by hand. But there were no footprints around it, no sign of tools or shovels. Just that smooth, gaping hole in the earth. A cold feeling crept over me. I don't know why, but I suddenly wanted to get as far away from it as possible. I turned and kept moving. By the third day, something felt off. The forest was too quiet. Normally, you hear birds, insects, the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. But now there was nothing, just silence. I tried to ignore it. I kept hiking, following my planned route. But the further I went, the worse the feeling got. I kept thinking about that hole. Who had dug it? Why? And why did it feel like I wasn't supposed to be here? That night, I set up camp in a dense thicket of trees, hoping the cover would make me feel safer. I ate quickly, zipped myself into my tent, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime after midnight. Something had woken me. A sound. A soft, distant thump. I lay completely still, listening. Then I heard it again. A deep, heavy thump. Like something large was being dropped onto the forest floor. It was coming from the direction of the hole. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I packed up and started moving before the sun was up. I wanted to get out. I didn't care about finishing the route anymore. I just wanted to be back on a real trail, somewhere familiar. But no matter how far I hiked, the landscape didn't look right. I checked my compass. It said I was heading west the way I had come. But the hills were wrong. The valleys were too steep. I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I tried using my GPS. No signal. Panic started creeping in. I had been careful. I had planned every step of this trip. So why did it feel like I was walking in circles? By midday, I saw something through the trees. Clearing. Relief washed over me. Clearing meant visibility. Maybe I could see where I was. Get my bearings. I pushed through the underbrush, stepping into the open. And then I stopped. The hole was in front of me, the same one. I had been walking for hours. I had been heading west. So why was I back here? My stomach twisted. My hands were shaking. This wasn't possible. I had to go. I turned and started moving fast, half jogging through the trees. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just needed to get away. The trees blurred past. My breath came hard and fast. My pack felt heavier with every step. Then, after what felt like miles, I saw another clearing ahead. I stumbled into it, gasping for air, and froze. It was the same clearing, the same hole. Only now there was something at the bottom. I stepped closer, my legs trembling. It was dark down there, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A shape, a body. No, not a body. My body, lying at the bottom of the hole, face down, wearing my clothes, my backpack, my boots. My mind went blank. My skin went ice cold. I turned and ran. I don't remember how far I went. I don't remember stopping. All I know is that at some point, the trees thinned, and I saw the shimmer of a lake. A familiar lake. I had made it back to the first night's campsite. I collapsed at the edge of the water, gasping for breath. The sun was setting, and in the reflection on the water, I saw movement in the trees behind me. Something was watching me. I didn't turn around. I just started walking. I walked all night, not stopping, not resting. By the time the sun rose, I stumbled onto a dirt road. A truck was parked there. Some fishermen getting ready to head out. I must have looked half dead because the guy barely asked questions before driving me back to the main road. I never reported anything. What would I even say? That I found a hole in the woods with my own body at the bottom? That I kept walking in circles? Like something was keeping me there? No one would believe me. Hell, I don't believe me. But I know one thing for sure. I will never go into those woods again. And I will never, ever go near that hole. Hiking alone had always been my thing. I liked the quiet, the solitude, the challenge. There was something about being alone in the wild that made me feel more alive. like the distractions of modern life disappeared, leaving only the raw, unforgiving world around me. I had done dozens of solo hikes, even in remote areas. I wasn't reckless. I always carried a map, a GPS, extra food, and an emergency beacon. I knew what I was doing, but none of that mattered when I made a simple mistake. And mistakes in the wilderness don't forgive. I had planned a 5-day solo trek through the northern part of the Continental Divide. It was a rugged, remote area, far from tourist trails and casual hikers. The terrain was tough, steep ridges, dense forest, unpredictable weather, but I had spent weeks planning my route. The idea was to hike in about 15 miles the first day, set up camp near a small alpine lake, and spend the next few days looping through the high country before making my way back to the trailhead. I felt prepared. I had done harder hikes before, but what I didn't realize, what I couldn't have known, was how quickly things could go wrong. The hike started smoothly. The weather was perfect, cool air, a light breeze, not a cloud in the sky. I moved fast, covering miles easily. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. I reached my planned campsite by mid-afternoon, a beautiful, secluded lake surrounded by tall pines. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the mountains above it like glass. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat by the water as the sun dropped behind the ridgeline. It was the kind of silence you only get deep in the backcountry. No cars, no voices, just the distant sound of insects and the occasional creaking of trees in the wind. That night, I slept soundly. That was the last good night of sleep I would have. The next morning, I packed up and continued hiking. The trail I was following became less distinct, narrowing into a faint game path winding through thick forest. I checked my GPS every so often, making sure I was still on course. Around midday, I reached a steep section of terrain where the trail seemed to disappear completely. I wasn't too worried. I had my map, my GPS. I knew the general direction I needed to go, so I kept moving. That was my first mistake. I should have stopped right there. I should have carefully rechecked my bearings, maybe even backtracked to find the trail again. But I was stubborn. I told myself I could find my way, so I picked a direction and started hiking. The trees grew thicker. The ground became uneven, covered in loose rocks and tangled roots. My progress slowed. The further I went, the harder it was to tell where I had come from. Then, after about an hour of hiking, I pulled out my GPS again. No signal. I frowned, moving to a more open area. Still nothing. That was when the first real sliver of fear crept in. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to get my bearings. But nothing around me matched what I saw on the map. The ridgeline I thought I had been following was gone, replaced by steep, unfamiliar hills. Somewhere along the way, I had gone completely off course. I was lost. I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't in real danger yet. I had plenty of food and water. The best thing to do was backtrack, retrace my steps, and find the trail again. So I turned around. But the problem was, everything looked the same. The trees, the slopes, the rocks. I couldn't tell where I had come from. My footprints, if they had been there at all, were gone. I picked what I thought was the right direction and started walking. 30 minutes passed, then an hour, and nothing. The terrain was getting worse, steeper slopes, thicker underbrush. My legs ached from climbing over fallen logs and pushing through tangled branches. I checked my GPS again. Still no signal. That was when the second wave of fear hit me. I had no idea where I was. I spotted a ravine ahead, a narrow, steep-sided cut in the forest floor. If I could get down into it, I might find a stream, and streams usually led to larger water sources, maybe even a real trail. So I started descending. It was slow going, the dirt was loose, and I had to use tree roots and rocks for support. Then, about halfway down, the ground beneath me gave out. I felt myself slide, my feet scrambling uselessly for grip. I hit the side of the ravine hard, rolling over jagged rocks before slamming to a stop against a fallen tree. Pain shot through my side. My vision blurred for a moment. I lay there, gasping, trying to assess the damage. My left ankle throbbed. My ribs ached. My hands were scraped raw. I wasn't dead, Nothing seemed broken, but I was hurt, and I was stuck at the bottom of a ravine with no trail, no signal, and no idea where I was. I set up a rough camp by the ravine wall, using my emergency blanket for warmth. The temperature dropped fast, and soon, I was shivering violently. I forced myself to eat, even though I wasn't hungry. My body needed fuel. As the light faded, the sounds of the forest changed. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees. Small animals scurried in the underbrush. Then, sometime after dark, I heard something else. Something moving. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not an animal. Something or someone was out there. I held my breath, listening. The sound circled my camp once. Then silence. I barely slept that night. The first light, I packed up and started moving. I climbed out of the ravine, my injured ankle protesting with every step. I had no real plan, just keep going, keep moving downhill. Hope for a road, a sign, anything. Hours passed. I rationed my water carefully. My body ached. Then, just as the sun began to drop, I saw something through the trees. A road. A wave of relief crashed over me. I stumbled onto the pavement, barely believing it was real. Minutes later, a car appeared in the distance. I waved it down, my legs barely holding me up. The driver, a middle-aged man with a look of concern, rolled down his window. The last thing I remember was him saying, "You okay?" Then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital 2 days later, dehydrated, exhausted, my ankle badly sprained, my ribs bruised. They told me I had been less than 2 miles from a ranger station when I found the road. 2 miles. If I had gone the other direction, I might not have made it out at all. I never went that deep into the backcountry alone again, and I never figured out what had been walking around my camp that night. Hiking alone had never scared me before. In fact, I preferred it that way. No distractions, no small talk. Just me, my thoughts, and the wilderness. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, sometimes even in remote areas where there were no official trails. As long as I had my map, compass, and GPS, I never felt like I was in any real danger. But this trip was different. This time, I made a mistake, and it nearly killed me. I had planned a 4-day solo trek through a remote section of national forest. It wasn't a well-known area. No designated campsites. No maintained trails, just raw, untouched land. That's exactly why I chose it. The route was supposed to take me deep into the backcountry, past a series of small lakes and up to a high ridge where I could see for miles. I had my map, my GPS, enough food and water, and all the emergency gear I could need. I felt prepared. The first day went exactly as planned. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a cool breeze. I followed an old game trail for the first few miles, winding through thick pine forests and open meadows. By mid-afternoon, I had reached my planned campsite near a small, crystal-clear lake. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the water as the sun set. The silence out there was absolute. No distant traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. I slept well that night, completely at peace. I had no idea what was coming. The second day started off fine. I packed up early and headed deeper into the wilderness. The trail was faint, but I had marked my route carefully. By midday, I had climbed higher into the hills. The landscape had changed, rockier terrain, denser trees. The trail had nearly disappeared, but I kept moving, checking my GPS every so often to make sure I was on track. Then, somewhere along the way, I lost it. 1 minute, I was following a clear path. The next, it was just gone. I backtracked, thinking I must have missed a turn. Nothing. I checked my GPS, but the signal was weak, barely functional. Still, I wasn't worried yet. I had my compass. I knew which direction I needed to go, so I kept moving. That was my first mistake. I should have stopped right there. I should have taken my time, reoriented myself, and figured out where I had gone wrong. But I didn't. I kept walking, convinced I would pick up the trail again. The terrain was getting tougher, steeper slopes, thick underbrush that forced me to push my way through. I was burning energy fast. After another hour, I realized I had no idea where I was. I stopped, took a deep breath, and checked my GPS again. No signal. That was when the first bit of real fear crept in. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to match the terrain around me to what I saw on paper. But nothing looked right. The hills seemed steeper than they should have been. The tree line didn't match what I expected. I turned around, thinking I should retrace my steps. But the second I did, a wave of doubt hit me. Had I come from that direction? Or was it the other way? Everything looked the same. I swallowed hard. I was lost. I forced myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I still had daylight. I still had supplies. The smart thing to do was to find a high point, get my bearings, and try to relocate the trail. I started climbing. The hill was steeper than it looked, covered in loose dirt and jagged rocks. I had to use my hands to steady myself as I climbed. My legs burned. My pack felt heavier with every step. By the time I reached the top, I was gasping for breath. I turned, expecting to see the landscape open up below me. But what I saw made my stomach drop. More trees, more hills, nothing recognizable, nothing that told me where I was. And then I saw something worse. In the distance, storm clouds were rolling in. I needed to find shelter, fast. I scrambled down the other side of the hill, my boots slipping on loose rock. The wind was picking up now, rustling through the trees with an eerie whisper. I spotted a small clearing and decided to set up camp there. It wasn't ideal, but I couldn't keep hiking blind. As I pitched my tent, the first drops of rain started to fall. Within minutes, it was a downpour. Lightning flashed across the sky. The thunder was so loud I could feel it in my chest. I huddled inside my tent, listening to the wind howl through the trees. I had planned for a lot of things on this trip. A storm this bad wasn't one of them. At some point during the night, I woke up. The rain had stopped, but something else had taken its place. A sound, a soft, rhythmic crunching. Footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed completely still, listening. The sound was close, moving through the trees just beyond my tent. My first thought was a bear. I reached for my knife, my heart hammering. But something about the way it moved didn't feel right. It wasn't the heavy, deliberate steps of an animal. It was slower, more careful, like someone was trying to be quiet. I waited, barely breathing. The footsteps circled my campsite once. Then nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my knife in the dark. The first light, I packed up and moved. I didn't care about finding the trail anymore. I just needed to get out. I pushed through the forest, ignoring the pain in my legs, ignoring the hunger gnawing at my stomach. Every so often, I stopped to listen. Nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. The sense that I wasn't alone. By midday, I finally heard something good: water. I followed the sound until I reached a small stream. I drank deeply, refilled my bottle, and then followed it downhill. Water always led somewhere. After hours of hiking, the trees started thinning. Then suddenly I saw it, a road. I nearly cried. I stumbled onto the pavement, my legs shaking beneath me. Minutes later, a car appeared in the distance. I waved it down. The driver, an older man, took one look at me and immediately let me in. I never went that deep into the wilderness alone again, and I never figured out what had been out there with me. I've been hiking alone for years. It started as a way to clear my head, to escape from the noise of everyday life. There's something about being out in the wilderness with nothing but a pack on your back that makes the world feel simple. Out there, it's just you and the land. No distractions, no stress, just survival. I've done all kinds of solo trips, long trails, backcountry treks, even some off-trail bushwhacking. I know how to read a map. I know how to navigate. I know how to survive. But nothing prepared me for this trip. I had my sights set on a remote section of wilderness in the northern Rockies. It wasn't a well-traveled area. No marked trails, no campsites, just deep forest, steep ridges, and a few hidden lakes that barely anyone ever visited. I had spent weeks planning the route. The goal was to hike in about 15 miles, camp near an isolated lake, and spend a few days exploring before looping back. I had all the supplies I needed, enough food for 5 days, a water filter, a GPS, a paper map, and a compass. I was confident. The hike started off easy. The air was crisp, the sky clear. I followed an old logging road for the first few miles, then cut onto a faint game trail that led deeper into the forest. It was exactly what I had hoped for. No people, no noise, just the sound of my boots crunching on dirt and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. Around midday, I stopped to check my bearings. The trail was getting harder to follow, but that was expected. I double-checked my GPS and my map, then pushed forward. By late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was beautiful, perfectly still, surrounded by thick pine trees, no signs of people anywhere. I set up camp near the water's edge, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the shoreline as the sun went down. The silence was absolute. That night, I slept deep. The next morning, I packed up and started heading toward the next waypoint on my route, a ridge about 5 miles away. The goal was to follow a faint trail along the lake, then climb up to higher ground. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. The path was rough but manageable. I was making good time. Then, at some point, the trail just disappeared. I wasn't too worried at first. Trails fade all the time, especially in remote areas. I checked my GPS, but the signal was weak. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to reorient myself. I knew the general direction I needed to go, so I kept moving, assuming I'd pick up the trail again soon. But after an hour, I still hadn't found it. The terrain was getting rougher, steep slopes, thick underbrush, loose rock. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. I checked my GPS again. The signal was completely gone. I wasn't lost yet, but I was off course, and that was bad. I should have stopped right there. I should have set up camp, waited for a better signal, or even backtracked all the way to the lake. But I didn't. I told myself I could fix it. I kept moving, trying to work my way back to where the trail should be. But the deeper I went, the worse things got. The forest was denser now. The trees packed so tightly together that barely any sunlight reached the ground. I had to push through thick branches, climb over fallen logs, and squeeze through gaps in the undergrowth. I kept checking my compass, making sure I was still heading in the right direction. But nothing looked right. I was burning energy fast. My legs ached. My pack felt heavier with every step. And then, I made the worst mistake of all. I tried to take a shortcut. I spotted a steep ravine that looked like it might cut through the ridge. If I could get down and climb the other side, I might be able to pick up the trail again. It was risky, but I was frustrated, tired, and starting to panic. So I went for it. First, it seemed like a good idea. The descent was tricky, but I took it slow, using tree roots and rocks for support. Then, about halfway down, the ground gave out beneath me. I felt myself sliding, loose dirt and gravel carrying me down. I grabbed for something, anything, but my fingers scraped uselessly against rock. Then I hit something hard. Pain shot through my side. My vision went white. For a second, I couldn't breathe. When the world came back into focus, I was lying at the bottom of the ravine, my body twisted awkwardly against a pile of rocks. My left leg throbbed. When I tried to move it, pain exploded up my side. I bit down, forcing myself to stay calm. I wasn't dead. Nothing felt broken, but I was hurt, and I was stuck. I tried to stand, but my leg wouldn't take the weight. I sat back down, breathing hard. I needed to get out of there. I checked my supplies. My water bottle had cracked in the fall, leaking most of its contents. My GPS was useless without a signal. I pulled out my emergency beacon. My hands shook as I pressed the button. Nothing happened. I stared at it, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. It should have worked. It had a built-in battery, a direct satellite connection. But the light didn't turn on. No signal. I was completely alone. I forced myself to focus. Panic wouldn't help me. I needed water. I needed shelter. I needed to move. I crawled forward, dragging my injured leg behind me. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't afford to stop. I didn't know how far I had fallen, but I knew one thing. I had to get back up. I used my arms to pull myself up the slope, inch by inch. Dirt filled my nails. My muscles screamed. The sun was dropping fast. Shadows stretched long across the ground. And then I heard something. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something else. A sound. Footsteps. Not alone. I stopped, holding my breath. The sound was close. Slow, deliberate. Someone was up there. I looked around, trying to see through the trees. Nothing. Then the footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding. The silence stretched on. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't wait to find out. I forced myself to move again, ignoring the pain. I needed to get out. By the time I reached the top of the ravine, the sun was gone. The forest was dark. I didn't see anyone, but I knew I wasn't alone. I moved as fast as I could, limping, stumbling, pushing through branches. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out. Then, finally, after what felt like hours, I saw something through the trees. A road. I stumbled onto it, barely believing it was real. Not long after, headlights appeared in the distance. A truck slowed down. A man got out, his face full of concern. Collapsed. I never went that deep into the wilderness alone again, and I never found out who or what was out there with me. I had been hiking for years, so when I decided to take a solo trip deep into the backcountry of the Pacific Northwest, I didn't think twice. I planned everything carefully, brought a GPS, a paper map, extra food, a first aid kit, and all the gear I needed to last several days alone. I wanted to disconnect from everything, enjoy the quiet, and push myself. I had done solo trips before, but never this far from civilization. The first day was perfect. The trail wound through dense pine forests, climbing steadily toward higher elevations. The air was crisp, and the sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows. I took my time, setting a slow but steady pace, stopping to filter water from a clear stream, and eating a packed lunch on a rock outcropping with a beautiful view of the valley below. By late afternoon, I reached a flat clearing near a small lake. It was an ideal campsite. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the water, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The silence was absolute. No traffic noise, no voices, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. That night, I slept deeply, feeling safe and at peace. But that was the last moment of comfort I would have on this trip. The next morning, I broke camp early, eager to cover more ground. My plan was to follow an old, less-traveled trail that cut through a remote section of the wilderness. It wasn't marked on newer maps, but I had found references to it in old hiking forums. The trail was supposed to reconnect with the main route after about 10 miles. For the first few hours, everything was fine. The path was narrow and overgrown but still visible. I kept checking my GPS and compass to make sure I was headed in the right direction. But as I went deeper, the trail became harder to follow. Trees had fallen across the path, thick brush covered sections of it, and soon I found myself climbing over rocks and ducking under branches just to keep moving forward. Then, at some point, I lost the trail. I didn't notice immediately. I had been navigating around obstacles for a while, assuming the path would become clear again. But after another 20 minutes, I stopped and really looked around. There was no trail beneath my feet anymore, just untouched forest. I pulled out my GPS. It showed my location, but the path I had been following wasn't on the screen. I checked my paper map, but the area was just a blank section of trees with no clear landmarks. I wasn't worried yet. I had plenty of experience with off-trail navigation. I turned back the way I had come, thinking I would retrace my steps until I found the trail again. But after another half hour, nothing looked familiar. I tried not to panic. I had a compass. I had a GPS. I could figure this out. But the deeper I went, the worse things got. The terrain became uneven with steep slopes and thick undergrowth. Fallen logs blocked my way, forcing me to climb over them, slowing me down. At one point, I nearly slipped down a rocky incline, catching myself on a tree at the last second. The forest looked the same in every direction. The trees were tall and tightly packed, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight. I hadn't seen a stream, a clearing, or any kind of landmark in hours. I tried to use my GPS again, but the battery was draining faster than I expected. I switched to my compass, trying to head west toward where the main trail should be. But after another hour of walking, I still found nothing. The sun was starting to go down. I forced myself to stay calm and set up camp in a small clearing. I had enough supplies to last a few days. If I stayed put and used my emergency whistle, someone might hear me. But when I blew it, the sound barely carried through the thick trees. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the forest felt amplified. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant crack of a falling branch. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the wilderness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, I tried a different approach. Instead of wandering aimlessly, I climbed a steep hill to get a better view of the landscape. It took longer than I expected. The loose soil and dense vegetation made every step exhausting. When I finally reached the top, I scanned the horizon, looking for anything. A river, a break in the trees, a distant road. Nothing, just endless forest in every direction. I checked my water supply. I had enough for maybe 2 more days if I rationed it. Food wasn't a huge concern yet, but the thought of running out made my stomach tighten. I needed to find water. I started heading downhill, hoping to find a stream. After an hour, I finally heard the faint sound of trickling water. I followed the noise until I reached a small, muddy creek. I filtered the water, filled my bottles, and took a long drink. For a moment, I felt a little better, but then I noticed something. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, pressed into the damp soil near the water's edge. But they weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, and they were big. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Who the hell was walking around barefoot this deep in the wilderness? There were no towns or roads nearby, no campgrounds, nothing. I scanned the trees, my heart pounding. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched crept over me. I grabbed my gear and moved fast. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that creek. As night fell, I found a spot beneath a rocky overhang and set up a small fire. I had barely eaten all day, but I had no appetite. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept replaying everything in my head. Had I imagined those footprints? Had they been old, and I just convinced myself they were fresh? Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal too heavy. They stopped, then started again, circling just beyond the firelight. I gripped my knife and held my breath. Then, nothing. Just silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I packed up and moved as fast as I could. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just kept going. And then, finally, I saw something through the trees. A dirt road. I stumbled onto it, barely believing it was real. I followed it for miles until I saw a parked truck. A man was loading gear into it, clearly a hunter or another hiker. I don't even remember what I said to him. He drove me back to a small town where I got food, water, and cell service. I called for help, and within hours, I was back in civilization. I never went that deep into the wilderness alone again. I never found out whose footprints those were, and I don't want to. I have always enjoyed hiking alone. There is something peaceful about being deep in the wilderness, away from the constant noise of life. No emails, no notifications, no people. Just me, my backpack, and the trail. This trip was supposed to be simple. I had planned a 2-day solo hike in a remote mountain range, somewhere off the beaten path. Nothing extreme, just enough to challenge myself. I had done longer, more difficult hikes before. I knew how to navigate, how to handle rough terrain, how to stay safe. The trail I chose wasn't an official one. It was something I found through an old hiking forum, a lesser-known route that a few hardcore hikers had recommended. The pictures were stunning. A high-altitude valley, untouched by tourists, surrounded by sharp peaks and deep forests. A place few had ever seen. The warnings were clear. The trail was faint. The terrain was steep. It was easy to get lost. That didn't worry me. I was prepared. I packed everything I needed: extra food, plenty of water, a solid map, a GPS, and a personal locator beacon in case of an emergency. My gear was light but durable, everything tested on previous hikes. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures. I set off early in the morning. The first few miles were easy. The trail was faint but visible, winding through dense pine forests. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of damp earth and resin. Birds called out in the distance, and occasionally, I heard the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. The incline was gradual at first, then steeper. The forest started to thin, giving way to rocky terrain. The sun was high, and sweat dripped down my back as I climbed. I reached a ridge by midday. The view was incredible. Rolling hills, deep valleys, endless forests stretching far beyond what I had expected. I checked my map and GPS. Everything was on track. I was making good time. But then, I noticed something strange. The trail was supposed to continue along the ridge before dropping into the valley. But there were two paths. One went in the expected direction, but the other veered slightly downhill into a narrow ravine. The map didn't show this. I pulled out my GPS. The signal was weak, but it still pointed me toward the valley. The upper path seemed right, but the lower one looked more traveled, with faint footprints in the dust. I hesitated. I should have followed the ridge, but something about the lower path felt easier, more natural, maybe a shortcut. I took it. First, the trail was fine, narrow but manageable. It twisted downward through rocky outcrops, then back into dense forest. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer. The trees were taller here, their thick branches blocking most of the sunlight. After about an hour, I noticed the trail was fading. The dirt path became patchy, then disappeared completely into the undergrowth. I stopped, checked my GPS. No signal. I turned, expecting to see the way I came, but something felt wrong. The trees looked unfamiliar. The slope seemed steeper. I couldn't see the ridge anymore. I told myself not to panic. I had a map, compass. I could backtrack. I turned around and started walking. After about 20 minutes, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My own footprints, smeared in the dirt, slightly faded but unmistakable. I had walked in a circle. I took a slow breath. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I just needed to climb back up, find the ridge. I adjusted my direction, moving more carefully, marking trees with small scratches from my knife. The forest felt different now. The silence was heavier, the air thicker. Another hour passed, then another. I checked my map again. It made no sense. I should have reached the ridge by now. Then, I saw something strange. A tree, but not just any tree. A marked tree. It had deep, jagged cuts in its bark, like something had clawed at it repeatedly. The marks were old. The exposed wood darkened and weathered. I looked around. More trees, the same deep scratches. Some marks were high, others lower, as if something had been tearing at them. I crouched, touching one of the marks. The edges were smooth. No tool had made this. No hiker. A shiver ran through me. I needed to get out. I started moving faster, pushing through the undergrowth, ignoring the burning in my legs. My breath came hard, my pack feeling heavier with every step. Then I smelled it, a sharp, metallic scent. I stopped, listened. Nothing, but the smell was strong. Blood. I didn't want to see it, but my eyes found it anyway. A few yards ahead, hidden behind thick bushes, a carcass, a deer, or what was left of it. The body was torn open, ribs exposed, flesh dark and rotting. The head was twisted at an unnatural angle, the legs mangled. I wasn't alone. Panic surged through me. My mind screamed at me to move. I turned, heart pounding, legs shaking. Then a sound, a rustling, deep in the trees. I froze. It wasn't the wind. Something was there, watching. I didn't wait. I ran. Branches tore at my arms and face as I crashed through the undergrowth. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs screaming with exhaustion. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just needed to get away. The smell of blood faded, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing against a tree. My chest heaved, my entire body trembling. Silence, then a noise. Not behind me, ahead. I held my breath, listened. Water, a stream. I forced myself up, stumbling toward the sound. If I found water, I could follow it. Water leads to rivers, rivers lead to civilization. I pushed through the trees, and there it was, a narrow stream cutting through the forest. The relief was overwhelming. I followed it. For hours, the light faded, the sky darkened. My legs barely held me up. Then a road, an old cracked dirt road. A signpost, weathered and leaning. I had never been so relieved. I kept walking, legs shaking, until I saw headlights. A truck. I waved, nearly collapsing as it pulled over. The driver looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I was. I never told anyone about the marked trees, the carcass, the feeling of being followed. I didn't need to, because I know what I felt, and I know something is out there. I've always loved hiking alone. Something about the quiet, the deep woods, and the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world. It calms me. It's a break from the constant noise of life. No phone, no distractions, just me and the trail. That's why I picked this hike. It wasn't one of those crowded, tourist-heavy trails where you pass families and joggers every few minutes. No, this one was remote, barely even marked on the maps. I found it through an old online forum where people shared hidden trails. A guy had written about a path deep in the mountains, one that led to a stunning valley few had ever seen. His pictures were incredible. He had also warned that it was easy to get lost if you weren't careful. I had done longer, more dangerous hikes before, so I wasn't worried. I packed light but smart, enough water, some snacks, a knife, a flashlight, and a fully charged GPS. I figured I'd be out for most of the day, maybe get back around sunset. The first few hours were perfect. The air was crisp, and the trail wound through dense forest, the kind where sunlight barely touches the ground. The silence was peaceful, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. The trail was faint, barely more than a thin line of dirt, but I followed it carefully, stepping over fallen branches and weaving through thick undergrowth. A few miles in, I noticed something odd. The trail forked. That wasn't supposed to happen. The forum post had mentioned a single path leading to the valley, not two. I checked my GPS. The signal was weak, but it still showed me on the right path. I hesitated for a second, then chose the left fork. It looked more worn, like more people had walked it. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trees got thicker, the undergrowth denser. The air felt different, heavier. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just my own breathing and footsteps. An hour passed, then another. The trail wasn't leading anywhere. My GPS had stopped working completely, and my phone had zero service. That didn't bother me at first. I was used to bad signals in the mountains, but something else started to feel wrong. The trees all looked the same twisted trunks, the same dark patches of moss. I stopped and looked around, trying to find anything recognizable. A rock formation, a fallen log, but everything blurred together. It was like the forest was swallowing me. I decided to turn back. That's when I saw it. A boot print. My boot print. I had walked in a full circle. My stomach tightened. I had been hiking straight for at least an hour. There was no way I had turned back without realizing it. But there it was, my own footprint, slightly smudged but unmistakable. I took a slow breath and tried to stay calm. Getting lost was part of hiking. I had a compass, water, supplies. I just needed to retrace my steps carefully. I turned around and walked faster, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. The forest felt darker now, even though the sun was still up. The air was thick, heavy in my lungs. My breathing sounded too loud, my footsteps too sharp. I kept moving. I was sure I was making progress. Then I saw it again. My footprint. I had walked in a circle again. I stopped and stared at it, my heart pounding. No, that wasn't possible. I hadn't turned around, hadn't made any loops. I was paying attention, moving straight. And yet, here I was back in the same spot. A cold sweat ran down my back. I was lost, really lost. I forced myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to keep moving, find a landmark, find anything. Then, for the first time all day, I heard something. A sound deep in the woods. A rustling, slow, deliberate. Not wind, not an animal. I wasn't alone. My chest tightened. I turned my head slightly, scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. Just dense forest stretching endlessly in every direction. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. I shook it off and kept walking, this time faster. My boots crunched against the dirt, the only sound in the suffocating silence. Then it came again, closer. A branch snapped. I froze. The sound was behind me. I turned slowly. Nothing, just trees, still unmoving. I wasn't imagining it. Something was there. I moved faster. My heart was hammering. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A mountain lion? No, those don't stalk like this. They don't follow quietly. Another sound. Closer. Panic surged through me. I broke into a run. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get out. My legs burned as I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping against my face and arms. I wasn't thinking, just moving. Then a clearing. Sudden, wide open space. The trees stopped abruptly, and in front of me was a stretch of bare ground, covered in dead leaves and rocks. It didn't look natural. I stopped, gasping for breath, and then I saw them, scattered across the clearing, barely visible under the leaves. Bones. Not animal bones. Human. I stared, my body frozen. Some were small, others larger. Some old, bleached white. Others newer, darker. A metallic smell hit me. Not just decay. Something sharper, more bitter. The sound came again, right at the tree line. I turned. The trees were too thick, too shadowed. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. Something was standing there, just out of sight. Watching. My body moved before my brain did. I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't think. I just ran. The forest blurred past me. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. But I didn't stop. Then a road. I burst through the trees and stumbled onto the pavement, falling to my knees. Gravel scraped my palms. The sudden openness felt unreal. I looked back. Nothing. Just trees. Quiet. Still. I didn't wait. I forced myself up and followed the road until I found a ranger station miles down. I barely remember explaining what happened. They sent a team out, but they found nothing. No bones, no clearing. Just trees. They told me I must have been disoriented. Maybe dehydration, maybe panic. Maybe my mind playing tricks. But I know what I saw, and I know something was out there, waiting,